Ladies, wait outside. The men need some privacy, honey. This is a closed brief, and it's above your line. Go grab a coffee. There's a machine by the stairs." The steel door stood behind him like something built to survive a fire. A slab of gray metal, a cipher lock with worn keys, a small light above the frame that glowed red for secure and green for open. And just then, it glowed red. The corridor smelled of cold air and toner. A binder for sign-in sat on a shelf by a badge reader, its pen chained to the wall. The major filled the doorway the way men fill a doorway when they have decided the doorway is theirs. The woman in front of him wore a dark travel jacket and plain slacks. A visitor badge hung at her collar on a lanyard. It read, in block letters, "Escort-Pending." Her watch was turned inward on her wrist, the face against the pulse, the way people wear a watch when they don't want it catching light. She did not carry a phone. She did not carry a bag. She carried nothing but herself, and she held that very still. "Understood," she said. One word. She stepped back from the door. She did not leave. Arguing spends a thing she had learned long ago, never to spend early, and there was nothing in the corridor worth spending it on. She moved instead to the wall where the corridor bent, the spot from which she could see the steel door, the stairwell mouth, and the badge reader all at once, and she set her back to it and waited. She read the corridor the way other people read a phone. Exits. Cameras. The 3-second cycle of the badge reader's little green blink. The count of planners she could glimpse through the open vault door. She became the stillest object in a building full of motion, and motion moved past her without noticing she was there. She catalogued the corridor without appearing to look at any of it. 2 cameras, one over the badge reader and one at the stairwell, their little black domes angled so that the seam of wall she stood in was covered by neither. A fire door 40 feet to her left, propped a half-inch by a rubber wedge that someone would be counseled for later. A whiteboard by the security desk with a duty roster and a smear where a name had been erased and rewritten. The countdown clock through the open vault door, the exfil slide, the shape of the horseshoe table. She did the thing she always did in a new building, which was to decide, quietly and for no one, how she would take it and how she would hold it. And then she folded that away and simply waited, because a plan you keep in your pocket costs nothing to carry. Down the stairwell came a command sergeant major with a stack of red boards under one arm. Otis Grady, 50 years old, 30 of them in uniform, a man who had carried classified paper through more rooms than most officers had ever entered. He came up 2 steps at a time out of habit, and at the top of the stairs, his eyes crossed the woman against the wall, and his boots stopped. He knew that face, or he knew the thing behind it, a call sign, surfacing out of a decade of rumor, and one very bad night he had only heard about secondhand. He did not say it. A sergeant major learns the difference between a thing he knows and a thing he can prove, and he stood in that gap now with his red boards and his silence. He set the boards on the security desk. He watched. Inside the vault, Major Dane Whitlock had gone back to his kingdom. 38 years old, sharp in his uniform, a planning cell officer who had spent 3 weeks turning a joint task force confirmation brief into a performance. And he ran the horseshoe of planners in front of him, like a conductor who suspected the orchestra of laziness. A countdown clock on the wall read 9 hours and change. A slide glowed behind him, an exfil timeline, arrows and windows, and a single bridge. "Recut that slide, Captain. The margins are ugly," he said to a young officer at the end of the table. And then, before she could answer, "No, don't tell me why. Just do it." The young captain closed her mouth. It was not. The woman in the corridor understood. A single bad morning. You could read the culture in the small motions of a room, the way you could read weather in the way birds sat on a wire. The junior officers laughed a beat before the joke, the way people laugh when the laughing is really listening for approval. The one captain doing the arithmetic sat a little apart, her chair angled out of the horseshoe, half a person removed from a room she was carrying. And the major moved through all of it with the particular ease of a man who has never once, in his life, been the person told to wait outside, a man for whom every door had opened, and who had decided that meant the doors were his to hold. Marchetti had commanded men like him. She had also, on 2 occasions she did not enjoy remembering, been slowed down by them. She watched him hold his door, and she filed him, and she waited. A colonel who had commanded task forces stood in a corridor holding a visitor badge that said "Escort-Pending," having been told to fetch coffee. The one man in the building who recognized her kept his mouth shut. The man who had dismissed her went back to running a briefing that was, though he did not know it, hers. She waited, and she watched, and she began, without moving at all, to take the room apart in her head. The captain's name was Priya Anand, 30 years old, a planner 3 years into the kind of career that gets measured in slides, delivered, and coffees fetched, and she was the only person in the vault doing the actual arithmetic of the thing. She owned the logistics annex. She had built the movement tables. And she had a problem with the exfil window that she had raised twice and been waved off twice, and she was about to raise it a 3rd time. "Sir," Anand said, "the exfil window assumes the north crossing stays open past 2200. I've got it closing at 2120. That's a gap." Whitlock did not look up from his notes. "The window's fine, Captain. I've run more of these than you've sat through. Stop gold-plating it. We are 90 minutes from a 3-star walking through that door, and I am not going to hand him a plan that looks like a committee wrote it. It's 40 minutes over the team's heads, sir. It's a rounding error, and it's handled." He finally looked up, and his voice softened into the shape that is somehow worse than shouting. "Priya, trust the plan. It's a good plan. It's my plan." She sat back. The gap stayed on the wall, glowing, uncorrected, 40 minutes wide. Out in the corridor, none of the planners saw the woman step to the open edge of the doorway. She had drifted 3 feet, no more, into the seam of the hall where the exfil slide caught the light, and she read it the way a mechanic listens to an engine. It took her the length of one breath. The crossing, the window, the clock. 40 minutes. She read the whole crack in the whole plan in less time than it takes to sign a name, and her face did not change at all. A young NCO came up the corridor at a half-jog with a hard drive in a labeled sleeve and a stack of transfer forms, flustered, late for something, and he swiped his badge and made for the row of drop bins along the wall. He had the wrong bin. The sleeve in his hand was marked for one compartment, and the bin under his fingers was marked for another. And in a building like this, the space between those 2 marks is measured in careers. "Wrong bin," the woman said. Quiet. Flat. "That one's collateral." "Stop!" The NCO stopped, as if she had put a hand on his chest. He looked at the sleeve. He looked at the bin. He was, she could see, 1 inch and 1 second from a spill that would have shut the floor for a day and ended a very good young man's morning. He moved the drive 1 bin left to the mark that matched, and the little light there blinked green, and he let out a breath that shook. "Ma'am," he said. "Thank you, ma'am." She had already looked away. It was a small thing, and it was not a small thing. A drive in the wrong bin is a paragraph in an incident report that becomes a page, that becomes a week of interviews. And everyone who touches the floor that day inherits a share of it. And the young NCO with the shaking hands would have carried the largest share for the smallest reason. She had stopped it with 6 words and no drama, and she had not raised her voice. And that, the quiet of it, the way she had reached into a crisis and set it down gently and stepped back out, was the thing Grady had been watching for all morning without letting himself name why. He had heard the call sign years ago, third hand, in the way stories move through a community. A recovery in 2013. A commander who brought everyone back across a bridge that closed on a clock. A staff sergeant who did not make the crossing. He had never met her. He had carried the story the way you carry a coin someone gave you, turning it over sometimes. And now the coin was standing in his corridor drinking his building's bad air with a badge that said, "ESCORT-PENDING," correcting spillage risks with 6 words and letting a major send her for coffee, and a sergeant major of 50 who had thought he was past being surprised found that he was not. Grady saw all of it from the security desk. 6 words, and a spill that never happened. He came off the desk and crossed to her the way you cross to a live wire. Careful, respectful, and he stopped a polite distance off and kept his voice under the corridor noise. "You've done this before, ma'am," he said. She met his eyes. "Once or twice." That was all either of them said. A command sergeant major and a woman with a flagged badge understood each other completely, and neither of them said the quiet part, because the quiet part was 3 floors up in a general's aides folder, and it was not theirs to open early. Whitlock chose that moment to step into the corridor for air and found his sergeant major standing close to a woman in civilian clothes, heads bent together, and his whole morning of nerves rearranged itself into an easy, wrong story. A wandering VIP spouse, getting the tour, cornering his best NCO. "Sergeant Major, don't let the guests get turned around," he said, brisk. And to her, kindly, the way you speak to someone you have decided is lost. "Ma'am, the family waiting area is 1 floor down. Comfortable chairs, coffee that's better than ours. We'll be a few hours." She let it stand. She had just kept a spill off the floor with 6 words, and the man running the brief told her the family waiting area was 1 floor down, and the only visible sign that any of it registered was the sergeant major beside her, standing a half-inch straighter than the room deserved. By the middle of the morning, Whitlock had found his rhythm, and his rhythm had an audience, and an audience makes some men generous with other people's dignity. He came to the vault door with 2 junior officers trailing him, and he called down the corridor to the woman against the wall as if he had known her for years. "Ma'am, you're a lifesaver. Do me a favor. The machine on this floor makes tar. There's a good one on the 2nd floor, by the stairs. Cream, no sugar, and a smile. You'd be doing the whole task force a service." One of the junior officers laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the laugh people give the man who writes their evaluations, which is a different thing, and sometimes a worse one. She considered the countdown clock. She considered the man, and she went, not because he had told her to, but because the errand put her precisely where she wanted to be, on her feet, in the building, reading it, with a reason to move through it that no one would question. She went down the stairs with her badge squared and her watch turned in, and her hands empty. And she counted the floors and the fire doors and the cameras on the way, because that is a habit that does not switch off. And she found the 2nd floor machine and pressed the buttons and waited while it filled 2 cups. Anand found her there. The captain had followed her down, coloring, embarrassed for a stranger, in a way the rest of the room was too comfortable to be. "I'm sorry about him," Anand said. "He's not always. He's under pressure. The op stands up in 9 hours and he wants it perfect." The woman handed her one of the cups without being asked. "What time does the bridge close?" she said. Anand blinked. It was her exact worry, the one she had carried alone all morning, coming out of the mouth of a woman she had watched get sent for coffee. 21:20, she said. "Local. Every night. It's on a schedule you can set a watch by. And the windows built to 2200. Yes. Anand's voice dropped. How did you? It's on the wall, the woman said, and drank her coffee and said nothing else. Anand stood there a moment with her own cup going warm in her hands. She had been the only person in the vault who had done the arithmetic, and she had begun, over 3 weeks of being waved off, to wonder whether the arithmetic was wrong, because that is what happens to a junior officer who is told enough times that her math is nerves. And here was a stranger in a travel jacket, a woman sent for coffee, who had looked at a slide across a corridor for the length of a breath and arrived at the exact number Anand had carried alone. It was not comfort, exactly. It was stranger than comfort. It was the feeling of finding one other person's footprints in snow you thought you had crossed by yourself. Can I ask what you do? Anand said. The woman considered the question the way she considered everything, as though it cost something. I read timelines, she said, which was true, and was also the smallest possible version of the truth. And Anand, who did not yet have the ears to hear how small it was, nodded as though that explained the morning. A thread pulled tight between them, invisible, and Anand carried her cup back up the stairs, turning it over in her mind, not knowing what she had just touched. Back in the corridor, the woman stood where she could see the exfil slide through the open door, and she held a cup that steamed into the cold air, and she let the plan tell her the rest of its secrets. 40 minutes. A single crossing. A clock no plan can argue with. 2 people in the whole building could see the crack in it. The captain everyone talked over, and the woman they had sent to fetch the cups. There is a particular kind of anger that comes from watching someone competent be treated as furniture. And if you have ever felt it, if you have ever sat in a room and watched the loudest person in it be wrong while the quietest person in it was ignored, then you already understand this channel, and you should subscribe to Honor Tales, because this is the whole thing we do here, and the part you are waiting for is coming. 2 cups of coffee, cream, no sugar, carried by the one person in the building qualified to command the mission, and 40 minutes of error glowing on a wall that the man who ordered the coffee could not see. She decided, around the 11th hour of the morning, to try the plain thing. She did not try the loud thing. The loud thing would have been to say her name, and a name said, "Too early is a card played too early." And besides, she was learning too much to want the morning to end. But a plan with a 40-minute gap over a team's heads is not a thing a commander lets ride to make a point. So she took a page from the pad on the security desk, and she wrote 6 lines in a small, even hand. The crossing, the closure time, the window, the gap, and the fix. A second crossing 2 kilometers south that stayed open, and a shifted departure that made the whole thing honest. She folded the page once. She carried it to Grady. "Sergeant Major, put this in front of the brief officer. Please." Grady took it like a man being handed something warm. He knew what it probably was. He carried it into the vault, and he set it at Whitlock's elbow, and he said, "Lo, sir. Worth a look." Whitlock unfolded it. He read 6 lines of clean staff work with no rank block at the top, no signature, no sponsoring command. Just the truth in a stranger's handwriting. And because it had no rank on it, he could not see it. He saw a civilian aide playing soldier. He saw someone reaching into his vault and touching his plan. And a man who is frightened of looking unready in front of a general does not receive a correction as a gift. He receives it as an attack. "Who is this woman?" he said, and his voice had gone thin. "Who signed her in?" "Sergeant Major. Who claimed her?" "No one's claimed her yet, sir." "Which is exactly why I'd—" "Flag the badge." Whitlock stood. He held the 6 lines up between 2 fingers, as though they were something he had found stuck to his shoe. Clean handwriting. A crossing time he had not verified, because he had decided a week ago that it did not need verifying. A gap he had already been told about twice, and had already decided did not exist. A fix laid out in the flat, complete grammar of someone who had done this before. And it was that. The competence of it, the sheer, unbothered correctness of it, that made him angriest, because correct handwriting with no rank block at the top of it was, to a frightened man 90 minutes from a general, an accusation. Somebody was reaching into his vault. Somebody was telling him his plan was wrong in a hand he did not recognize. And the thing about a man who has never been told to wait outside is that he has also never learned how to be corrected by someone he has decided is beneath the correction. Escort-pending means pending, until someone with a name and a rank walks in here and claims her. She is not in my vault. She is not near my plan, and she is certainly not passing me notes. Have her wait downstairs. The security guard, a young specialist who called everyone ma'am and sir and meant it, walked the woman back to a bench in the corridor with an apology in his posture. He reflagged her badge at the reader. He offered her the family waiting area again, gently. She thanked him. She sat. She folded her hands. She did not name herself. The commander of the operation had just been administratively removed from her own confirmation brief, and she had let it happen, because a bench in a corridor is also a place from which you can see a door. Grady tried once more, obliquely, because oblique was all his lane allowed. He caught Whitlock at the coffee station and kept his voice down. Sir, I'd claim her, if I were you, before someone else does. Whitlock heard a sergeant major being cryptic under pressure. Everybody's a fortune cookie today, he said, and walked off. The woman named at the top of the orders sat on a bench outside the vault with a flagged badge, hands folded, while the countdown clock on the far wall burned toward an exfil window that was already 40 minutes wrong. Grady stopped waiting and started confirming. He went to the sign-in binder first, the one chained to the shelf, and he ran his thumb down the visitor line until he found the entry from that morning, before the badge was flagged. A last name, a sponsoring command 3 levels up, and a scheduler's shorthand in the notes column that Whitlock had never once bothered to read. Commander, inbound, early. 3 words, in a clerk's cramped hand, sitting in a binder in a corridor, telling the whole story to anyone who looked. He made one phone call from the security desk to a number he was not going to have to explain to anyone junior to a general, and he asked one question, and he listened to the answer, and he hung up and stood for a moment with his hand still on the phone. Then he went to find the major. The answer had been 4 words long. It had confirmed the call sign, and it had confirmed the orders, and it had confirmed that the woman on the bench in the corridor was the reason every person in that vault had reported to work that morning. Grady had stood there afterward and felt the whole shape of the day tilt. The coffee run, the flagged badge, the folded note, the family waiting area 1 floor down. And he had understood, with the particular clarity of a man who has spent 30 years watching officers make and unmake themselves in small moments, that Major Dane Whitlock was about 90 minutes from the worst professional morning of his life, and that there was still time, right now, in this corridor, to save him from most of it, if only he would listen. Grady was a fixer by trade. He decided to try to fix this one, too. He dropped the indirection this time. He stood square in front of Whitlock in the corridor, out of the planner's earshot, and he said it as plainly as he was allowed. Sir, stand the badge flag down and bring her in. I'm telling you as clearly as I can, without saying a thing I'm not cleared to say in this hallway. You do not want the general to walk through that door and find her on that bench. Whitlock's jaw set. 90 minutes had become 40. The plan was locked in his mind as finished, and every soul who touched it now was touching a wound. "The general walks in," he said. "He'll find a tight brief and a clean vault. That's my job, Sergeant Major. Yours is the door. Let's both do our jobs." It was not cruelty. That was the thing Grady understood and could not fix. Whitlock was not a cruel man enjoying himself. He was a frightened one, 90 days from a promotion board, terrified of standing in front of 3 stars and being seen as the officer whose plan came apart. And he had decided somewhere around dawn that the plan was perfect because it had to be, and that anything that said otherwise was the enemy. The 40-minute gap survived not because he was evil, but because closing it meant admitting that a captain he talked over and a coffee lady he sent downstairs had both been right, and his pride could not hold that weight 90 minutes out. Fear wears competence like a coat. It is the most dangerous thing in any room, and it never thinks it is the danger. If you are wondering who she is, really is, and what happens to a man who spends a morning saying the word "my" to a woman whose name is on the order that put him in that vault, then stay with this one and subscribe if you haven't, because the paper is about to catch up to the major, and it is going to be quiet, and it is going to be total. The sergeant major had done everything but say the name aloud. The major had answered every warning with the word my vault, my briefie, my plan, while a scheduler's note that read, "Commander, inbound," early sat unread in a binder 10 feet from his bench. They ran a security sweep before the general arrived, the way they always do, and the vault had to be cleared. And so a guard moved the woman from the corridor bench to a small anteroom down the hall to wait where she would be out of the way. A table, a chair, a second countdown clock on the wall, honest and indifferent. She set the 2 coffee cups down, both gone cold now, and she sat with her hands still. And for the first time all morning she was unobserved. Her name was Colonel Delia Marchetti. She was 47 years old. She had commissioned in the year 2001 and spent the 2 decades since in the kind of work that is briefed in rooms exactly like the one down the hall and never named in any room without a door like that one. In 2009, they had selected her into the community and given her a call sign, Oracle 6, and she had worn it through places that do not appear on the slides that show where task forces go. The visitor badge at her collar was a formality. The orders with her name at the top were 3 floors up in a lieutenant general's aide's folder, waiting for the brief to start. There was a reason she read an exfil timeline the way she read one. The reason had a name, and the name was Emmett Cole. 2013. A recovery that ran long, the way they do, minutes stacking into an hour nobody had budgeted. The whole plan had come down, in the end, to a single crossing that closed on a clock, a bridge that shut at a fixed hour whether or not the people who needed it had made it across, and to the 40 minutes she had not had. Staff Sergeant Emmett Cole, 27 years old, had held the withdrawal so the rest of them could reach the crossing before it closed. He had done the arithmetic in his head the same way she did it, and he had understood what the clock meant, and he had chosen to be the reason the clock did not matter to anyone but him. She had brought every other soul home. She had read every timeline since, as though a life sat inside each minute of slack, because once, exactly once, one had. She could still see the plan they had briefed that year. It had been a good plan, mostly. It had been built by good people who were tired, and it had assumed, the way plans do when the people building them are tired and proud and running out of night, that one crossing would hold, that the clock was a suggestion, that the 40 minutes of slack they did not have would somehow be there when they reached for it. Nobody in that room had been cruel. Nobody had been lazy. They had simply loved their plan a little more than they had feared the clock, and the clock had not cared how much they loved anything. She had learned, standing on the far bank with a count that came up one short, that a timeline is not paper. A timeline is a promise you make to the people who will be standing in the open when it comes due. And you do not get to break that promise and apologize afterward, because the person you broke it to is not there to accept the apology. She did not think about coal every day anymore. She had made her peace with the shape of it, the way you make peace with a scar. It stops hurting, but it never stops being the map of where you were cut. But she thought about him in rooms like this one. She thought about him every single time a confident man in a clean uniform stood in front of a slide and used the word handled about a gap that wasn't handled. She had promised herself on the far bank, in the cold, with the count one short, that she would never again be in a room where the loudest person was wrong about a clock and the quietest person was right, and no one made the loud person stop. She had kept that promise for 13 years. She was not going to break it this morning for a major's feelings. That was why she had not named herself at the door. A commander learns more about her staff in the 90 minutes they believe she is the coffee than in 90 days of them standing at attention. She had watched Whitlock lock a plan out of fear and call it perfect. She had watched a captain named Anand carry the right answer alone and get talked over for it. She had watched a sergeant major recognize her and hold the line rather than break a confidence. She now knew, cold, exactly who each of them was, and exactly where the plan would fail, and exactly what she was going to do about all of it. The stillness had never been surrender. It was reconnaissance. The woman on the bench had spent a morning being told she did not belong in the room, and had used every minute of it to learn the room the way she had once learned a crossing that closed at a fixed hour and took a man named Cole with it. The sweep ended. The planners filed back in, and with the general's arrival now measured in minutes rather than hours, Major Whitlock did the thing that turned condescension into something with a time stamp on it. Anand raised the flaw one final time, and she raised it brave, on the record, in front of the whole horseshoe, because she had decided she would rather be the officer who annoyed a major than the officer who stayed quiet and read a casualty report later and knew. "Sir," she said, and her voice did not shake. "I need it logged. The exfil window assumes the north crossing is open past 2200. It closes at 2120. Every night. That is a 40-minute gap standing directly over the team's heads, and I want it in the record that I flagged it." The room went quiet. A few of the junior officers looked at the table. One of them, the one who had laughed at the coffee joke, looked at Anand with something that was not quite support, but was no longer quite comfort either. The first small crack in a culture, the moment a follower notices that the person being talked over keeps turning out to be right. Anand held her ground and did not look away from the major, and the countdown clock on the wall clicked over another minute, and the exfil window sat behind Whitlock's head, glowing 40 minutes wide. Whitlock looked at her for a long moment, and then he reached over and he locked the plan, on the record, out loud. "Logged and overruled," he said. "The plan is final. I am not rewriting a task force brief 90 minutes before a 3-star sits down because a captain has cold feet about a crossing. We brief it as written. It's on me. Put that in the record, too." He had wanted a clean vault. Now there was a timestamp, and there were witnesses, and there was a captain's flag logged directly beneath a major's override, and all of it was written down in the one kind of record that does not care whose plan it was. The guard walked Marchetti back to the corridor as the sweep cleared, badge still flagged, and she arrived at the open vault door just in time to hear the last of it. The lock, the overrule, the "it's on me." She understood, standing in the doorway with a dead cup of coffee she had never been allowed to deliver, that the man had just chosen his pride over the team, on the record, with a clock running. For the first time all morning, Delia Marchetti smiled. It was small, and it was level, and it had no warmth in it at all. "It's a good crossing," she said, to no one and to him. Right up until 9:20. Whitlock did not understand her, and did not try. "Ma'am, please, the adults are working," he said, and turned back to his slides. She went still again. The trap was closed, and he had built every inch of it himself, and he had done it in the 90 seconds before the steel door at the end of the corridor swung open and a 3-star general walked through it. Lieutenant General Raymond Prentice was 57 years old, 3 stars on each shoulder, a slim folder under his arm, and no entourage behind him, because men at his altitude do not need to arrive with noise. He came through the steel door and into the corridor, and his eyes went first, out of long habit, to the person who did not fit, the woman on her feet by the vault door in a travel jacket, a visitor badge at her collar reading "ESCORT-PENDING," a cold coffee in her hand. He stopped cold. "Colonel," he said, "why are you in the hallway?" The word landed in the corridor like a dropped plate. Colonel. Every planner within earshot heard it. The young officer who had laughed at the coffee joke heard it. Whitlock, at the lectern inside, heard it and did not yet understand it, the way you hear a word in a language you almost speak. Prentice did not raise his voice. He never had to. He looked at the flagged badge, and he looked at the young guard, and he said, "Stand that down." And the flag came off the badge with a small electronic chirp that sounded in the silence enormous. Then he stepped aside and gestured her through the vault door ahead of him, ahead of a 3-star general, which is a thing that does not happen for aides or for spouses or for anyone whose name is not already the answer to the question the room is about to ask. The horseshoe of planners half rose out of instinct as the general entered. Whitlock came around the lectern, still assembling the wrong story out of the pieces. The general, escorting the coffee lady, some VIP courtesy, some mistake he would smooth over, and he opened his mouth to smooth it. Prentice set the slim folder on the lectern. He opened it. And he read the appointment orders aloud, plain and unhurried, into the record, the way you read something that ends an argument nobody knew they were having. "By order of the Secretary," he said, "Commander, Joint Task Force, Colonel Delia Marchetti, call sign Oracle 6. He let it sit for one breath. "She has held command of this operation since Tuesday. Gentlemen, you have spent your entire morning briefing your commander's plan back to your commander." The paper was the reveal, not a shout, not a salute called across a formation, a folder, a name, read off the top of an order, into a room that had spent a morning stepping over it. There is a particular silence that follows the reading of a name, and it is different from every other kind of silence. It is the sound of a whole room resorting itself. Every planner in that horseshoe ran the morning backward at once. The woman in the corridor, the 6 words at the badge desk, the folded note, the coffee, cream no sugar, and a smile, and relabeled each memory with the word Colonel, and then with the word Commander. And the relabeling made a sound like a building settling. The junior officer who had laughed put a hand halfway to his mouth. Anand, at the wall, felt the arithmetic she had carried alone for 3 weeks suddenly become the arithmetic of the woman in command, and something in her chest that had been clenched since dawn came loose. Whitlock's face went through its stations one at a time. Confusion first. A clerical error, surely. 2 people with the same name. Some mix-up he could fix. Then disbelief as his eyes went to the woman by the lectern, the aide, the coffee lady, and refused her. Then recognition, arriving all at once and from every direction. The 6 words that had stopped a spill at the badge desk, cold and exact. The 6 lines of clean staff work with no rank block, because a colonel does not need a rank block to be right. The small level smile and the words, "It's a good crossing," right up until 9:20, which he now understood, fully, and would understand every night for the rest of his career. And last, under all of it, the thing that was worse than the fear of arrest, because no one was going to arrest him, the specific, airless horror of a professional who realizes that his commander stood in the doorway and watched him lock a broken plan and silence the one officer who was right, and wrote nothing down, because she did not have to. The record had done it for her. He came to attention. The whole room came to attention, not because anyone shouted an order, but because a general and a colonel were standing at the head of a vault, and the truth had just been read into it, and the body knows what to do before the mind catches up. Marchetti set the cold coffee down on the edge of the lectern. She looked at the room full of stiffened spines, and she did the one thing no one expected, which was to spend none of the moment on the man who had earned it. "At ease," she said. 2 words. And then she turned, past Whitlock, as if he were furniture now, in the way she had been furniture at dawn, and she aimed the whole weight of the room's attention not at the major at all, but at the captain he had spent a morning talking over. "Captain Anand," she said, "brief me the exfil window, the real one." Anand stood. For a heartbeat, she could not believe the order was hers to answer. Then 22 years of somebody's daughter, becoming an officer, straightened her back, and she walked to the wall, and she briefed it, the way she had tried to brief it 3 times that morning, except that this time the room was silent, and the commander was listening, and the word overruled was not waiting at the end of it. "The North Crossing closes at 21:20 local, ma'am. Hard closure, every night. The current window runs the team's exfil to 2200. That's a 40-minute gap with no bridge under it." She took a breath and kept going, because the fix had been in her head for a week with nowhere to land. "There's a second crossing 2 kilometers south. It stays open. If we shift H hour 35 minutes earlier and route exfil south, the window closes clean with 15 minutes of slack." "Build it," Marchetti said. "You have the floor, and you have my authority. Anyone who is going to argue with the captain this morning can argue with me this afternoon." No one argued. Anand rebuilt the plan on the wall in front of the people who had watched her be dismissed, and she did it without gloating and without hurry, because she had learned something that morning about what it looks like to be right quietly, and she had learned it from the woman now standing at the head of the room. The 40-minute gap closed. A second crossing came up on the slide, 2 kilometers south, open past the hour. H hour slid 35 minutes earlier, and where there had been a lie on the wall an hour before, there were now 15 minutes of honest slack, sitting in the timeline like money in an account. Nobody would need to touch, and everybody would sleep better, knowing was there. 15 minutes. The exact kind of margin that, one night in 2013, had been the difference between a name on a homecoming list and a name on a wall. Marchetti watched the captain work and said nothing for a while, because the best thing a commander can do with a competent officer is get out of her light. When Anand finished and turned, uncertain, waiting for the word overruled to arrive the way it always had, it did not arrive. What arrived instead was a single nod, and the words, "That's the plan. Good work, Captain." And Anand discovered that a sentence she had waited 3 weeks to hear takes about 2 seconds to say when the right person is saying it. Then Marchetti turned to Whitlock, and the room braced for the part it had been trained by 100 other stories to expect. The cuffs, the guards at the door, the words "you are relieved," the investigation, the end of a career read out like a sentence. None of that happened. That was not who she was, and it was not what the morning had earned. "You built a clean vault, Major," she said. Her voice was even, and it was quiet, and it carried to every corner of the room. You ran a disciplined cell, and then you locked a plan you had been told twice was broken, once by a captain and once by a coffee lady, because admitting it was broken felt worse to you than briefing it broken to me. That is the failure. Not the coffee. Not the honey. The lock. A man died once inside a 40-minute gap that somebody was too proud to close. And I have spent 13 years making sure I am never the person who was too proud. Whitlock's throat worked. "Ma'am," he managed. "You'll stay," she said, and it landed harder than any relief could have. "You'll run logistics for Captain Annan's corrected timeline, and you will run it better than you have run anything in your life, because the team on that ground does not care about this morning, and neither do I, past the lesson in it. I am keeping you because firing you is easy, and teaching you is useful. And this task force needs useful. Prove me right. That's an order, not a favor." "Yes, ma'am." 2 words from a man who had used a great many more than 2 words all morning. And then, because a lesson only counts if it is paid for in front of the people who watch the offense, he turned to the captain he had waved off 3 weeks running, and he said it where the room could hear it. "Captain Annan, you were right. I logged the override, logged the correction under it, and logged that it was your call. I'll sign it." It cost him something to say. You could see it cost him. But he said the whole thing, and he did not soften the ending of it into an excuse. And Marchetti, who had been watching to see whether the man was merely embarrassed or actually teachable, made a small note behind her eyes that he might, with work, be worth the keeping after all. Grady, by the door, allowed himself exactly 1 breath of something like satisfaction, and then went back to being a sergeant major, which is a job that doesn't have room in it for very much satisfaction and gets done anyway. There is a satisfaction that has nothing to do with revenge. The satisfaction of watching the right person finally be handed the room, and of watching them spend that power, making the plan better instead of making an example. If that is the feeling you came here for, then you already know what to do. Subscribe to Honor Tales and stay to the end, because the end of this one is very quiet, and quiet is the point. The vault cleared to work. The task force stood up on the corrected timeline. H-hour shifted, exfil routed south, 15 minutes of slack held in reserve like a breath. Planners who had laughed at a coffee joke at dawn now moved with the particular focus of people who have just learned that the quietest person in the building had been the most dangerous one all along, and had chosen, for reasons of her own, to let them find out slowly. In the corridor, Otis Grady was waiting with a fresh cup. Cream, no sugar. He had made it himself on the bad machine on this floor, because it seemed like the thing to do. He held it out. "Good to have you back on a floor, Oracle 6, he said. And he said the call sign the way you say a name you respect. Low, and once, and complete. Delia Marchetti took the cup. She looked past him at the countdown clock through the open vault door, honest now, running down toward an H-hour that a captain had saved, and a major would live long enough to be proud of. No phone buzzed in her pocket, no screen lit with a dead man's call sign from some far theater. There was no next war waiting in the hallway to be teased. There was only this one, standing up on time, on a crossing that closed at 9:20, and a plan that finally respected it. Run by a woman who had let a room underestimate her exactly long enough to learn it, and then walked back in and commanded it. She drank the coffee. It was terrible. She drank it anyway, because the sergeant major had made it, and because some things you accept for the hand that offers them. "How did you know it was me?" she asked him, when the room full of officers didn't. Grady thought about it. "The room was looking at your badge, ma'am," he said. "I was watching what you did with a spill." He shrugged, a small, honest motion. "Rank is on the outside. The other thing isn't." She almost smiled. "Keep that captain in your eye," she said. "She's going to be somebody." And this building nearly talked her out of it. "Already am, ma'am." She looked once more through the open door at the vault, at Anand rebuilding movement tables with a straighter spine, at Whitlock bent over the logistics annex doing honest work with his ears still red, at the countdown clock running down toward an H-hour that was finally telling the truth. 13 years ago she had stood on a far bank in the cold and counted one short. She had promised herself a room like this one, where the clock got respected and the quiet officer got heard, and she had just spent a morning being underestimated in order to build it. It had been, she thought, a fair trade. "Thank you, Sergeant Major," she said. And she walked back into the vault to go to work. The operation launched on time, on a crossing that closed at 9:20, and a plan that finally respected it. And the commander who fixed it had spent the whole morning being told, kindly and often, that the men needed some privacy. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to Honor Tales for more.